In a hall built to dispense justice, an old man was about to be condemned for the crime of survival. His name was Samuel Jackson, but to the system he was just a problem to be erased, a docket number to be cleared before the day's end. He wore the silence of the courtroom like a shroud, a different kind of quiet than the ones forged in the humid hell of Southeast Asia. This silence was sterile, polished, and heavy with judgment. It seeped from the American flag hanging limp beside the judge's bench and the cold tile of the floor. He sat on the defendant's bench, hands resting on his knees, the skin over his knuckles like a cracked riverbed. The man who had once answered to sergeant with a spine of steel was now a ghost, a faded photograph of a soldier who had vanished 50 years ago. Today, he was just Case 9C 47881. Marcus Thorne, the assistant district attorney, moved with the predatory grace of a man who knew he was winning. His suit was sharp, his voice sharper. He painted a picture for the court, using words like nuisance, vagrant, and non-compliant. He spoke of business owners' rights and city ordinances, of the visual blight on the downtown commercial district. He was building a neat little box of legal jargon to put the old man in, a box that would be tidied away with 30 days of community service and an order that would ban him from the only sources of warmth and food he had left in the world. Thorne didn't see a man, he saw a file. He didn't see a life, he saw an obstacle to civic order. He was efficient, he was logical, and he was utterly, terrifyingly blind. And so, Thorne concluded, his voice ringing with the hollow finality of practiced rhetoric, the state requests that the court impose the recommended sentence to ensure the continued peace and security of the community. A heavy quiet fell. It was then that Judge Eleanor Vance spoke. Her voice was calm, a stark contrast to the prosecutor's aggressive energy. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning the document in front of her. "Mr. Jackson," she said, her eyes still on the page, "your file indicates you have a record of prior service." Thorne sighed audibly, a small puff of impatience. This was the judge's well-known soft spot, a moment of obligatory reverence before the inevitable gavel. Judge Vance continued, reading aloud in a clear, formal tone. Staff Sergeant Samuel Jackson, serial number RA15 221897, United States Army, active duty 1968 to 1974. Assignment. She stopped, her breath caught in her throat, a barely perceptible hitch. The courtroom couldn't see it, but her knuckles had turned white where she gripped the file. The next words came out slower, each syllable carrying a weight she hadn't anticipated. Assignment, 5th Special Forces Group, MACV-SOG, Theater of Operations, Vietnam. The air in the courtroom shifted. The label of Vagrant dissolved. The title of Green Beret replaced it. That uniform, the one he hadn't worn in half a century, suddenly filled the room. It was a symbol, a promise, a ghost. If you believe that a uniform once worn defines a person for life, hit that like button to show your respect. For Samuel Jackson, that uniform was about to reach across 50 years of hardship and demand a reckoning. Judge Vance stared at the name, but she was no longer in her courtroom. She was 6 years old, standing in the doorway of her father's study. He was home. Home from a war nobody understood. A place on a map called Laos. He was a pilot, Colonel Harrison Vance, a man who flew a Sky Raider and had been shot down. He was supposed to be dead, but he was home. And late at night, when he thought she was asleep, she would hear him talking to her mother, his voice low and haunted, about the men who had pulled him from the burning wreckage. A small team of shadows in the jungle. Army men, special forces. He spoke one name, a call sign he'd heard on the radio, a name he repeated like a prayer of gratitude. a name she had long since buried under the accumulated grief and memories of a lifetime. "Sergeant," Judge Vance said, her voice pulling her back to the present. It was sharper now, edged with an intensity that made Marcus Thorne frown. "The file is thin. It doesn't detail your engagements. Can you confirm your area of operations in 1971? "Objection," Thorne snapped, his patience gone. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the defendant's service history, however commendable, has absolutely no bearing on a criminal trespassing charge from last Tuesday." "Your objection is noted, Mr. Thorne," the judge said, her eyes not leaving Samuel. "And it is overruled. The character of the man before this court has every bearing on the matter at hand. I'll ask the question again, Sergeant. Where were you stationed in the spring of '71? Samuel Jackson shifted on the hard bench. He looked up, his gaze distant, seeing not a courtroom but a triple canopy jungle humid with the smell of rain and cordite. He saw faces, young men, ghosts who walked beside him still. "Laos, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, "near the Plain des Jars. We were advising." "Advising," the judge repeated softly, the innocuous word feeling like a lie even as she said it. She knew what advising meant for the men of Mac-V-Sog. It meant war in the shadows. Her heart pounded against her ribs. It was a wild, impossible coincidence. It couldn't be. But the look in the old soldier's eyes, a look that held 50 years of secrets, told her it might be. She was no longer just a judge. She was the daughter of a man who owed his life to a ghost. And she began to wonder if that ghost was now sitting in her courtroom, waiting to be sentenced. Just as she was about to press further, to ask the question that was clawing its way up her throat, the great oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with authority. A man strode in. He was young, Asian American, and wore a suit that was every bit as sharp as the prosecutor's, but he carried himself with a quiet, solid confidence, not arrogance. He walked with purpose to the defense table and placed a hand gently on Samuel Jackson's shoulder. He then turned to the bench, his gaze direct and unflinching. "Your Honor, my name is David Chen. Forgive my interruption, but I will be representing Mr. Jackson in this matter. Effective immediately." The courtroom buzzed. Samuel stared at him, utterly baffled. Thorne's mouth fell open in disbelief. Judge Vance gripped the edge of her bench, the impossible odds of the day, suddenly, dramatically changing. The silence was broken. A new voice had entered the fight. The gavel struck the wood with a crack that echoed Judge Eleanor Vance's fracturing composure. "This court will recess for 15 minutes, she announced, her voice a thin wire of control. She rose abruptly and swept into her chambers, leaving a courtroom buzzing with confusion. Samuel Jackson sat motionless, watching the young lawyer, David Chen, follow the judge. He didn't know the man's name, his motives, or why he had just placed himself between a homeless veteran and the grinding gears of the justice system. For a man who had trusted his life to the men on his left and right in the darkest jungles on earth, this sudden, inexplicable act of alliance felt more foreign than any enemy firefight. Inside her chambers, the facade of judicial calm crumbled. "David, what is this?" she demanded, her back to him as she stared out the window at the city below. "General Peterson is 80 years old and retired. Why is he sending lawyers to my courtroom for a vagrancy case?" "He didn't send me, Your Honor." "Not exactly," Chen replied, his tone respectful but firm. He stepped forward. "I work with the Veterans Legal Aid Society, pro bono. The General is a major supporter. This morning he called me talking about old times, about your father. He mentioned he'd found an old mission debrief photo. A few hours later I heard from a clerk that a Green Beret from the SOG era, was on your docket. When I heard the name Jackson, I connected the dots and called the general back. He just said, 'Go, help that man.' He wouldn't say more." Eleanor turned from the window, her face etched with a conflict that went far beyond the bench. My father, the stories he told were fragmented. He had survivor's guilt, I think. He talked about the crash, the fire, the enemy closing in. She walked to a heavy credenza and opened a locked drawer. She pulled out a glass-topped case, the wood dark with age. Inside, on faded blue velvet, lay the Air Force Cross. He said this belonged to the sergeant who pulled him out. He never saw his face clearly, just a young man covered in mud and camo paint, moving through the chaos like he was born to it. He heard a name on the radio once. Jackson. He spent years trying to find him. The Army said the records were sealed, the mission too sensitive. Eventually, they told him the entire team was lost, presumed dead. She looked at Chen, her eyes pleading for an understanding he couldn't possibly have. For 50 years, my family has lived with the memory of a ghost who saved our father. Now, a man with that name and that unit appears in my courtroom, homeless and broken. What am I supposed to do? Chen met her gaze. He didn't offer legal advice. Instead, he offered a piece of himself. Your Honor, my parents were from Vietnam. In 1978, they escaped on a fishing boat with 60 other people. For 9 days, they drifted in the South China Sea. They were out of food, out of water. A storm was coming. They were dying. He paused, the inherited memory as real to him as any of his own. On the 10th day, they saw a ship. A U.S. Navy destroyer. A young American sailor, barely a man himself, was the first one to help them. He pulled my pregnant mother over the rail and, before he did anything else, he gave her his own canteen. Chen's voice was quiet, but it filled the room. My mother says she doesn't remember the sailor's face, but she will never forget the taste of that water. It tasted like hope. My family was given a future because of that one small act of decency by an American in uniform. The reason I do this work, the reason I am standing here now, is to pay back that canteen of water. I am here, Judge, because it's my turn to offer a man like that a drink. A profound understanding passed between them. It wasn't about the law anymore. It was about debts, the ones we owe, the ones we are paid, and the ones that are passed down through generations. When court reconvened, the tension was a physical presence. Thorne was on his feet, ready to pounce, but Judge Vance held the floor. Mr. Chen, before we proceed with the charges at hand, the court has one more question for a potential witness. Bailiff, please call Chief Master Sergeant Frank Miller to the stand. An older man with a silver flat top and shoulders squared by a lifetime of discipline rose from the gallery and took the stand. He was sworn in. Sergeant Miller, the judge began, you stated you were an Air Force pararescue man. Were you on duty in Laos in the spring of 1971? Yes, ma'am, I was. And were you part of a combat search and rescue mission for a downed pilot, an A-1 Sky Raider, call sign Voodoo 1? Yes, ma'am. That was Colonel Vance, your father. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Thorne shot to his feet. Objection! Your Honor is turning this into a personal inquisition. Sit down, Mr. Thorne, Judge Vance commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that silenced him instantly. Sergeant Miller, please describe the tactical situation on the ground. Miller turned his gaze to Samuel Jackson, a look of 50-year-old respect in his eyes. The situation was a hornet's nest, ma'am. We were taking heavy relay fire. Couldn't get low. The colonel was pinned in his cockpit, legs shattered, aircraft burning. We were seconds from bugging out. Then a voice came on the guard channel. Calm. Professional. It was him. He nodded at Jackson. Sarge. He was the ground commander of a 5-man SOG team that had seen the crash. They were outnumbered 20-1, at least. Miller's voice was clear, his memory sharp as glass. He directed our fire, told us where the enemy gun emplacements were. He popped smoke to mark the landing zone, a zone that was smaller than this jury box. I went down on the jungle penetrator. The heat from the wreckage was intense. Your father's leg was wedged under the instrument panel. I couldn't get him free. I thought we were both dead. He took a deep breath. Then, out of the smoke and chaos, Sarge was just there. He didn't say a word. He handed me his rifle, took out a combat knife, and started prying the console off your father's leg. The whole time, his men were putting down a wall of fire that sounded like the end of the world. He got the colonel free. We strapped him to the hoist. The last thing I saw as we went up was Sarge, dragging a wounded man of his own, providing cover fire for his team as they vanished back into the jungle. He was the last man out. He was always the last man out. The courtroom was utterly still. The story hung in the air, a testament to a bravery that defied time and circumstance. Marcus Thorne slowly sank back into his chair. The legal arguments and city ordinances he had championed moments before, turning to ash in his mouth. He was no longer prosecuting a vagrant. He was prosecuting a hero, and Frank Miller wasn't finished. The raw, unvarnished truth of Frank Miller's testimony hung in the air, thick and heavy as jungle humidity. It was a story of pure, uncomplicated heroism, a relic from a forgotten war. But Marcus Thorne, the prosecutor, was a product of the complicated peace that followed. He rose to his feet, not with bluster, but with a quiet, burning intensity that was more intimidating than any legal objection. Your Honor, he began, his voice low, but carrying to every corner of the now silent room. We have just heard a remarkable story, a story of courage that deserves our respect. But this courtroom is not a VFW hall. We are not here to award medals for actions taken 50 years ago. We are here because this man broke the law last week. He took a step towards the jury box, though there was no jury, addressing the conscience of the room itself. My father was a veteran. He came home from that same war. He didn't come home to parades. He came home with shrapnel in his leg and a ghost in his eyes. He never told war stories. He never spoke of heroes. He drank. He yelled. He saw enemies in every shadow, and the weight of what he'd done, of what he'd seen, crushed him. It crushed my mother. It crushed our family. Thorne's professional veneer was gone, replaced by the raw pain of a son who had inherited a war he never fought. So, forgive me if I am cynical about a good war story. For every soldier saved, how many were lost? For every hero made, how many families were broken? We put these men on a pedestal for what they did over there, and then we avert our eyes when we see them sleeping on our streets over here. It is the ultimate hypocrisy. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom. What does true honor mean to you? Is it a single act of bravery in the past, or a lifetime of accountability in the present? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. This man is not a symbol, Thorne said, his voice hardening as he pointed at Samuel Jackson. He is a citizen who broke the law, and the law must apply to him, just as it applies to everyone else. His words were a cold dose of reality, a powerful argument against the rising tide of emotion in the room. He sat down, confident he had wrestled the narrative back to the indisputable facts of Case 9C-4781. Judge Eleanor Vance let the silence linger, allowing Thorne's painful logic to settle. Then she picked up the grainy black-and-white photograph from her desk. It was her only weapon against his cold reason. "Sergeant Jackson," she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the tension. "I want you to look at this photograph. It was taken moments after my father was lifted out of the jungle. It is not very clear, but I need you to tell me what you see." The bailiff carried the photo to the defense table. Samuel Jackson stared down at it. For a long moment, he said nothing. He wasn't looking at the photo. He was looking through it, through 50 years of guarded memories. "His flight suit was torn," Samuel said, his voice raspy, distant. "At the collar. He had a deep gash over his right eye. He kept trying to refuse the morphine, said to give it to the other wounded men. But there were no other wounded men, just him. And us." He looked up, his eyes locking with the judge's. And his eyes, they were blue, a very clear blue. Even with all the fear, they were clear. Eleanor Vance took a deep breath, the last piece of her composure holding by a thread. The pilot, in that wreckage. The man with the torn collar and the clear blue eyes. That was my father, Colonel Harrison Vance. You saved his life, Sergeant. The confession, spoken aloud, sent a shockwave through the room. But before the full impact could land, Frank Miller, the old pararescue man on the stand, shot forward, his face a mask of disbelief and sudden, horrified understanding. "My God, Judge!" he exclaimed, his voice cracking. "Now it all makes sense. We couldn't figure it out. We put Sarge in for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation went all the way to Saigon. But a month later, it came back denied. The file was sealed, and his entire unit, his entire 5-man team, was reclassified. They were ghosts." Miller stood from the witness stand, his voice booming with righteous fury. "They told us the team was compromised after the rescue, that their position was overrun." He took a step towards the defense table, his eyes boring into Samuel Jackson, who seemed to shrink under the weight of the revelation. "Your Honor," Miller said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, thick with awe. "This man isn't just a hero. He's a ghost. The United States Army listed him as missing in action on March 12, 1971. A year later, they changed it to presumed killed in action." The courtroom fell into a silence so profound it was like a vacuum, sucking all the air from the room. The truth was almost too immense to comprehend. Samuel Jackson hadn't just saved the judge's father and melted back into the jungle. He had walked straight into hell for it. He had been captured. He had been a prisoner of war. For years, he was a name on a wall, a ghost in a file, a man whose sacrifice was so complete that his own country had erased him. Eleanor Vance stared at the man before her, the homeless man, the vagrant, the hero, the ghost. She saw the years of suffering in the lines on his face, the quiet dignity in his posture, the honor that no circumstance could tarnish. The tears she had been fighting finally broke free. She stood up, not as a judge, but as a daughter, as a citizen, as a witness to a resurrection. "In light of this testimony," she said, her voice shaking but resolute, "all charges against Staff Sergeant Samuel Jackson are hereby dismissed with extreme prejudice." She picked up her gavel, but didn't strike it. Instead, she looked out at the silent, watching faces. "Will everyone please rise?" It was not a request. It was a command to bear witness. Frank Miller snapped to attention, his salute as sharp as it was 50 years ago. David Chen stood, placing a supportive hand on Samuel's shoulder. In the gallery, the other veterans rose as one. Then the civilians, the clerks, the bailiff, the onlookers who had come for routine drama and found profound history. Finally, after a moment of internal struggle, Marcus Thorne slowly, deliberately, rose to his feet. The entire courtroom stood in silent tribute, a wave of honor washing over the man who had been lost in the shadows for far too long. The judge's gavel lay untouched. The sound of its wood striking the bench would have been an intrusion, a violation of the sacred silence that held the courtroom captive. As the room stood in a unified wave of respect, a testament to a ghost made flesh, it was not the judge who broke the spell, but the old para-rescue man, Frank Miller. His voice, a gravelly baritone that had once cut through the shriek of rotor blades and machine gun fire, now sliced through the stunned quiet. "All right, that's enough standing around," he barked, his eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire. He turned to the assembled crowd. "This man doesn't need our pity. He doesn't need to wait another 6 months for some government clerk to find his file. He needs a roof, he needs a hot meal, and he needs it tonight." He ripped off his own VFW Garrison cap, a cap adorned with the pins of a dozen campaigns, and slapped it onto the prosecutor's table. He pulled a thick wad of cash from his pocket, peeled off a $100 bill, and dropped it in. The bureaucracy failed him for 50 years. We will not fail him for another 5 minutes. This is on us. This is our watch. The effect was instantaneous. It was a call to arms, a summons to a debt that everyone in the room suddenly understood. A Vietnam veteran in a leather vest limped forward and dropped in a set of keys. "Got a rental property on Elm Street. It's his until they find him a permanent place." A woman who had been weeping silently pushed through the crowd. "My husband was a Marine. He passed last year. Please, take this." She added a check with a shaking hand. David Chen, his phone still pressed to his ear as he navigated the labyrinth of the VA, watched with a slow smile. He ended his call and walked over to the bailiff, who was now guarding the impromptu offering plate. "Make sure that gets to Sergeant Jackson," Chen said, handing the bailiff his business card. "And tell him his first appointment with the Department of Veterans Affairs is at 0800 tomorrow. I'll be picking him up myself." The press, having caught wind of the extraordinary events, had gathered outside. As Chen escorted Samuel Jackson through the throng of reporters, he didn't speak of legal victories, he spoke of moral ones. "Let me be clear," he announced to the flashing cameras. "What happened in this courtroom today was not a dismissal of a case. It was the correction of a 50-year-old clerical error. Our city did not pardon a vagrant. It finally recognized a hero. And our nation's promise to those who serve is not a suggestion. It is a sacred contract. Today, we simply began the process of paying a long-overdue invoice." 3 weeks later, Samuel Jackson stood by the window of a small but immaculate apartment. Snow fell in thick, silent flakes, blanketing the city in a clean, quiet peace. The apartment was furnished simply: a bed, a table, a chair. It was more than he'd had in a decade. On the wall hung a single frame, but it held a universe. Inside, the deep blue ribbon of the Air Force Cross lay beside a photograph of a tall, smiling pilot. A soft knock came at his door. It was Judge Vance, though today she was just Eleanor. She held a flat, velvet-covered box. "I thought you should have this," she said, stepping inside. He opened the box. Nestled inside was the Medal of Honor, the one awarded posthumously to her father for a lifetime of service that began on the day Samuel saved him. "He was awarded this a year before he passed," Eleanor said. "At the ceremony, he said it didn't belong to him. He said it belonged to the men of SOG Team Viper, the men who bought him his future with their own. He said it belonged to you." Samuel traced the star-shaped medal with a trembling finger. "He was the hero, ma'am. I just did my job." "That's what he said you would say," she replied, a sad smile touching her lips. "But you didn't just do your job, Sergeant. You didn't just save one man. You saved my family. Because you pulled him out of that fire, he got to come home. He got to walk me down the aisle at my wedding. He held his grandchildren. My son, Harrison, is a doctor now. He volunteers at a free clinic twice a week. My daughter works with refugee families. They are good people because they were raised by a good man." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it was almost a physical force. "The good that my father put into this world for 30 years after the war. That was you. You started that. You bought him that time. That is the true result of what you did in that jungle. It wasn't just a rescue. It was a creation." For the first time in 50 years, the weight in Samuel Jackson's chest lifted. The ghost of a question that had haunted his darkest nights, did it even matter, was finally banished. He looked from the medal to the picture of the pilot, to the face of the daughter who stood before him, the living embodiment of his sacrifice. He had not just survived. He had created a legacy of goodness he never knew existed. The story of Sergeant Jackson did not end when the gavel fell. It continues today, in every quiet hero living in our own neighborhoods. It reminds us that memory is not passive, it is an active choice. And honor is not just a monument we visit on holidays. It is an action we take in the present. Look around your own community. Who is the Sergeant Jackson in your shadows? Who is the forgotten hero stocking shelves at the local grocery store, or sitting alone at the diner? His story is not just a story to be watched. It is a debt to be repaid, a promise to be kept. It is a reminder that the watch is now ours. For more stories that honor our nation's heroes and remind us of the debts we owe, make sure you subscribe to Veteran Stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.